I didn't grow up wanting to be a coroner. No kid does, I guess, really. I actually wanted to be a doctor, but since I didn't have the grades for medical school and I still wanted to turn my love of anatomy into a career, I decided being a coroner was my best bet. Now, for those that are unaware of what a coroner does, I'll just break it down Barney style. Whenever someone dies, and we aren't super duper sure how they died, it's my job to take a look under the hood, as we say, and figure it out. I used to work in the city, and for quite a while too, but I feel like a man in my line of work can only work in a city for so long before he either quits, moves elsewhere, or loses his mind completely. Me, I decided to move elsewhere, somewhere quiet and calm, which is how I ended up in Polson, Montana. It's a pretty little town on the edge of a bay, and with just 5,000 people living here, it's considerably quieter than my previous home of almost 4 million. Now back there, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for me to complete 3 or 4 post-mortems in a 24-hour period. Now, I'm lucky if I see maybe 3 or 4 a year. And as you can probably imagine, that suits me just fine considering that I only took a minor salary hit. But then I guess, ironically, it's here that I performed the most memorable autopsy of my entire career. And it's one of those that's memorable for all the wrong reasons and why I sent you the story. Now one morning, I got a call from a deputy sheriff to tell me that a young girl had passed away. And from the moment I heard his voice, I knew that this one was going to be different. She'd been found the previous night, wandering on the 35 in her bare feet. The driver that spotted her turned around to see if she needed any help, and found a young girl on death's door. She looked terrible, starved and beaten, and was mumbling all kinds of gibberish till she eventually passed out. The driver tried to keep her awake and talking, and then when he realized that she was probably slipping away, he even tried performing CPR. But unfortunately, the poor thing passed away before the emergency crews could get to her. Naturally, the sheriff's department wanted to know exactly what killed her, but more importantly, they wanted to know if I thought that there was also a who element to it, as in, was it a tragic accident, or was it murder? But when the girl's body arrived at my office, I found that there were many more questions to be asked, and some very frightening ones too. And when it came time for the autopsy, the forensic pathologist I work with agreed that he'd never seen anything like it. At 5'7", the girl appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s, but she didn't weigh an ounce over 70 pounds. She was also this very sick shade of yellow, which indicated liver and kidney failure, but that wasn't even the half of it. She'd quite clearly been starved, and her body was so heavily covered in burns and scars that it seemed her abuse had been almost systematic. Like someone had been trying to slowly disfigure her, one patch of flesh at a time. We discovered the girl's eyes had actually been gouged out, and that her finger and toenails appeared to have been completely and deliberately removed. There was also evidence someone had tried to either torture or sterilize her by piercing her abdomen with some hot wires or needles. The technicians collected swabs and samples, and then the pathologist proceeded to cut that old distinctive Y shape into the chest of the deceased. And the effects of her starvation were evidence of the girl's organs, yet bizarrely we found quite a sizable amount of partially digested organic material in her lower digestive tract. Now this, along with samples of her blood and spinal fluids, was tested at our on-site laboratory, and what our technicians found was truly shocking. The contents of the girl's stomach turned out to be a mix of 2 very distinct varieties of fungi, fly agaric and the suitably named death cap. Now the death cap needs no introduction, as I'm sure you know. It does what its name suggests. Some might say that fly agaric is also suitably named because while ingesting it won't make you fly, it does have intense hallucinogenic effects on those who use it. The implications of its presence terrified us. And when it came to writing up the post-mortem, we almost didn't want to believe our own conclusions. Judging from the bruises around her wrists, ankles, and neck, someone had kept the girl prisoner, and the level of starvation suggested this had been for a considerable amount of time. During this period, She had been systemically tortured and maimed by someone exceptionally sadistic. Then, once she was hungry enough to eat just about anything put in front of her, the girl's captor fed her a fatal mix of mushrooms and just let her go. Even if she was still in possession of her sight, we judged the girl was far too weak to have mounted any kind of serious escape attempt. So either something inconceivable occurred and she wandered free from captivity, or her captor deliberately set her free. She spent her final hours wandering through the woods in what must have been complete confusion and unimaginable agony. It was the single most horrifying post-mortem I've ever had the displeasure of overseeing, but it raised the question, just who the hell was evil enough to inflict such an ordeal on an innocent young woman? Once our examination was complete and the final report written up, the girl's body was transported to a local funeral home. Our official conclusion was that the girl had been murdered via poisoning, and there were comorbid factors of starvation and historical physical abuse. And this led to a murder investigation being opened, but sadly, it's one that's never been closed. I've overseen many post-mortems in my time as a coroner, and there have been more memorable ones that I care to count. But not one of them haunts me, and I mean truly haunts me like that poor young woman who spent her final few hours on this earth blind, terrified, and wandering around alone in the middle of nowhere. Ever since I can remember, I've always been into post-apocalyptic movies and TV shows. That's no exaggeration either. The first movie I ever remember watching was a Peter Graves one from the 70s called Where Have All the People Gone? It's about a mysterious natural disaster, a solar flash that turns like 90% of people into ash and leaves everyone else to wander this deserted, dead landscape. If I watched it nowadays, I'd probably think it was pretty lame, but back then, it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. I mean, Mad Max was awesome too, but the idea of people disappearing seemed like it'd be sort of strangely peaceful. Now cut to about 15 years later, and I don't have to look far to understand my fascination with abandoned places. And throughout the summer of 1996, me and my buddy Stan started ticking off as many Texas ghost towns as we possibly could. We visited Mesquite over in Borden County, and then we hit up Best and Reagan and Langley over in Valverde. We'd walk around, take pictures, drink a few beers, and then drive back home once we were back under the limit again. And you might think once you've seen one abandoned town, you've seen them all, but that couldn't be any further from the truth. Each one has something unique to offer. It's just that sometimes that thing isn't always good. So after Langley, me and Stan started looking up other places to visit. It wasn't easy back then. We didn't have access to the internet to just look these things up. So when Stan found a place, he called me up excited as hell and told me all about a little place called Lobo. Apparently water was found in the area back in the mid-1800s, and it became a watering hole for pioneers heading west. A railroad depot was established a few years later under the designation Lobo because of all the wolves that roamed around the area, and that's how the town got its name. By the late 20s, the town had almost 30 permanent residents, but more than 100 railroad workers that were stationed around the depot too. There was a hotel, a general store, and a bunch of other businesses. And then came the earthquake. Well, 2 earthquakes, and then the wells ran dry. Stan said that, and he swore this was no word of a lie, a guy called William Christ bought the whole place in the 60s. He opened up a general store and a gas station in the hopes of reviving the place and offered discounted rents to anyone who'd come live there. But then, weirdly enough, there was a weird kind of crime wave around Lobo, and then a bunch of Bill Christ businesses all burned down one night, and he abandoned the place. That was 1991, meaning by 1996 the place had been abandoned for 5 years. But unlike a lot of other places, almost every building in Lobo was still standing. In fact, I'd say it was the most complete abandoned town we'd ever visited, and the closest I'd ever been to recreating the stuff I saw in Where Have All the People Gone. As you can imagine, I was absolutely over the moon, and so was Stan. It was like we'd walked straight onto the set of some post-apocalyptic survival movie. But little did we know, it was about to become part horror movie too. Because after walking around for no more than a few minutes, me and Stan had heard a sudden scream. It might sound dumb, but at the time, I looked at him and asked if he'd set it up. Like he'd, I don't know, paid someone to stop by and scare the crap out of me by unleashing some blood-curdling scream. But I turned to him, and the look of fear on his face told me all I needed to know. Since we'd heard Lobo was popular with urbex enthusiasts, some people who also appreciate abandoned places, we figured some other group had run into trouble, some obviously painful trouble by the sounds of things. So we did what we'd want anyone else to do if that was us in that situation, which was run to help. We ran in the direction of the screams, then as we got closer, we heard the sound of someone else cursing. I don't know about Stan, but I thought it sounded like whoever he was with trying to calm him down. He'd fallen, broken his leg, and his buddies telling him to keep quiet so he can concentrate. But it wasn't that at all. Stan yelled out, "Hang on, we're coming," at which point the person screaming started yelling, "Please help me," and all sorts of stuff. And we heard the other voice again too, and right away, I realized that we might have misjudged the situation. Something didn't sound right about the way that he was talking, but I could barely hear him over the screams. So I also didn't stop running because both me and Stan were still under the impression someone needed help. Well, they did. There was just no way that we could save them because the people making him scream found me and Stan before we could find the person needing saving. We didn't see the guy, we just saw some 6-foot monster wearing gloves and a crowbar, and then another guy, smaller, yelling at the bigger guy to get us. Now we turned on our heels and then sprinted all the way back to the car with that huge guy on our tail. But thanks to him being such a muffin, we were able to safely outrun him, and last time we saw him, he was in our rear view as we drove off. We called the cops from some gas station and drove with some deputy all the way back to where we'd been so he could see exactly what we were talking about. We didn't expect anyone to be there when we got back, and we were right on that. But what was left was a lot of blood. We think someone was being tortured. Maybe for information, maybe just revenge, and the people who orchestrated it were obviously some very shady people. If they were killing someone out there, they'd do it just before fleeing, right? So it had to be torture, and just writing that out gives me chills. It was the first time that we'd run into anything like that while touring some abandoned places, and while it wasn't the last, nothing ever quite compared to the insanity that happened that day in Lobo. You might find this a very unusual submission, but I think it's one that you and your viewers might enjoy, and while I prefer to remain anonymous, I can assure you that it's actually genuine. Now, without giving you my entire life story, I grew up in the United Kingdom, but my parents are Greek and Iranian. They met in London after emigrating, worked hard to make a life for themselves, and then had me. They pushed me to do well in school, consoled me when my attempts to become a footballer failed, and then were pleased as punch when I was accepted into Oxford University to study Greco-Persian history. Dad liked the idea of me staying in academia. Mom agreed but thought that I should study medicine. Yet not long after I graduated, I got a letter from an institution known as the Government Communications Headquarters who invited me to attend a job interview. Now, to the untrained ear, Government Communications HQ might sound rather boring, but let me assure you, it is not. That's because GCHQ is responsible for providing signals and intelligence to the government and armed forces of the United Kingdom. It was first established after the First World War, then during the Second, it worked on breaking German Enigma codes out of Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire. Now, getting hired by them didn't make me some glorified IT guy. It made me, for all intents and purposes, a spy. and I later found out that I'd been headhunted by their recruitment team while I was at university, partially because of my academic and sporting performance, but mainly for my language skills. I spoke a little bit of Greek, but my mom's side of the family were very involved when I was a kid, so while I wasn't completely fluent in Farsi, I knew much more than most about Persian language and culture and could easily pass as Iranian. And this made me an ideal candidate to spy on the Islamic Republic. So for the first 18 months of my career, I trained for that. But then, on a sunny afternoon, UK time, in September of 2001, 19 hijackers changed the course of history, as you know. And after the towers fell, and W told New York how the world was about to hear them, my department's focus shifted from Iran to Afghanistan. But seeing as the two countries have very similar languages, in Dari and Farsi, it made me a highly rated asset, and one that was itching to be deployed. Now, less than 2 weeks after the attacks, I was sitting in a briefing room going over the details of the assignment that I'd been given. London to Cyprus, Cyprus to Turkmenistan, and then from there, I'd transformed myself from a British civil servant to an Iranian journalist before taking a taxi over the border into Afghanistan. Now, my destination was the ancient city of Herat, where I'd gather intelligence on Taliban morale and troop numbers prior to what was undoubtedly going to be an American-led invasion. While in Herat, I learned that many Taliban fighters had been sent to the mountains around 30 miles southeast of the city. There, they were digging in, stockpiling munitions, and preparing to resist coalition forces. So, that's where I went. I was advised to hire a guide to escort me through the wilderness and towards the mountains. I didn't want to get lost, but neither did I want to attract too much attention to myself. So I hitched a ride to a small village within 2 days' walk of the mountains, then did just that. Walked. Getting up into those mountains made for the toughest hike of my life. Then following one particularly grueling climb, I was relieved to see a gently sloping valley that led deeper into the mountains. It was beautiful in its way, like a little slice of Shangri-La. But as I looked around, I suddenly spotted 2 men standing on a ridge some distance behind me. They were little more than specks all the way up there, but I could tell that they were watching me, and I remember thinking to myself, I'd be in a terrible spot of bother if one of those chaps had a rifle. As I walked further and further away from them, and the valley stayed nice and quiet, I started to relax. I started thinking that they were just 2 curious shepherds. But no sooner had that thought entered my head, the first bullet struck the rocks about 50 meters away from me. It was terrifying, impossible to put words into in a way, and I've never felt anything like it. There was nothing ahead of me but open ground, so all I could do was run as fast as I could and hope the gunman was just some goon with an AK and not an expert marksman. Because if he was, I was dead. And the first bullet landed about 50 meters away in a spray of dust and gravel, but when the second hit, it was even closer. It landed no more than 20 meters ahead of me after whizzing over my head. And the next was closer still, landing just within arm's reach. But by then, I had made it to a grouping of large rocks that I could bound between to put something solid between me and those bullets. And eventually I was faced with a stretch of open ground leading up to a gentle ridge, and I waited to see if another shot came, and then when I was met with only silence, I ran for the ridge, praying the gunman had given up and wasn't just reloading. But no more bullets were fired. It was a relief to be on the other side of the ridge, knowing I was totally out of sight, but I knew that I still wasn't safe. The gunman and his pal could be pursuing me, or there could be additional assailants waiting ahead. And with no choice, I pushed on as fast as I could until I suddenly spotted a plume of smoke rising in the distance. It wasn't until I got much closer that I realized that it was a tea house, and that was another huge relief, because with the sun beginning to set, it was an ideal place to bed down for the night. Most Afghan tea houses serve tea and simple meals, but many feature side rooms or second floors that function as guest houses. Guests are packed into one large room with nothing but a mat to sleep on, so it's not exactly the Ritz, but they serve as a wholesome shelter for travelers during the longer, colder nights and when the passes are blocked by winter snows. I drew some stairs after making my way inside, but after the owner rather loudly asked where I was from, my cover story seemed to lessen the tension. There was a clear interest in me, but I was left to eat and drink in peace. After a few hours of nursing cups of tea and talking with fellow travelers, I approached the tea house's owner regarding accommodation for the night. I was directed to a back room where, just as I expected, several other men sat on their sleeping mats, which were placed around the room. The walls were bare, the floor was covered in a mosaic of carpets, and there was a large silver tea set in the middle of the room. But what really grabbed my attention was the Kalashnikov that sat in one man's lap. Some of the men seemed to recognize me from the tea house's main room and greeted me before telling the others who I was, or rather, who I wasn't. I ran with my cover and began asking their thoughts on Al-Qaeda, the United States, Osama bin Laden, while writing notes in Farsi shorthand on a notepad.